Chuck Ford gave $10 US. Jesse, did the blacks from the presumably rural plantation you grew up on have a greater sense of community belonging and duty when compared to blacks living in urban ghettos today?
100%. When I was growing up, I never even heard the word racism. When I was growing up under the Jim Crow laws, blacks and whites got along. There was those who was in the fallen state didn't like the blacks. There was the blacks in the fallen state didn't like the whites. There were whites who were risen above that, got along very well with the blacks, likewise with the blacks. Black people worked for themselves. They didn't have leaders. There was no such thing as a leader. They fought for themselves. They did for themselves. There was no mention of government when I was growing up. It was not even heard of. They were independent people, and they treated everybody the same with love and honesty. And as a matter of fact, one of my aunts expired on this past Sunday. She died this past Sunday, and she was 90-something years old. She and her husband had 15 kids, 15. That was back in the good old days. And they owned land. And those kids all of them finished high school. All of them went to college. They are now getting married. They're having their own families. And that was in the good old days when the blacks pretended that Jim Crow law was so bad that black people couldn't make it. They're lying to you. It wasn't true. They were much better off then mentally, emotionally, and physically than they are today.
Again, another very, very interesting answer. Objective Realist gave $5. He said, it is not beta to recognize who created and pushed communism, commie revolutions, mass migration, trans agenda, etc., etc. It means identifying problems. Roy Danton gave $19.99. And he said, Jesse, you mentioned earlier you grew up in the Jim Crow era. Could you please talk a bit more about this time and how it was perceived by the black community? I pretty much don't know anything about that era.
That's a good question. Yes, I did. I grew up under the Jim Crow laws. I remember for colors only signs, for whites only. I remember we had to drink from all blacks water fountains and things like that. When we would go to town, you can see the difference between the folks who were into that and those who were not. But it wasn't a problem for us because we had family. We knew it was a bad law, but we knew that all white people did not agree with that law, that it was from those who were trying to keep the blacks down. And at that time, it was the Democratic Party. And we understood that. And so there were blacks and whites who got together to try to end that kind of law. But it wasn't what you've been told. Black Americans were better off under the Jim Crow laws than they are as under the so-called laws we have now. They're more enslaved now with being raised by single mothers. In America, somewhere between 72 and 77% of black children are born to black women who were born in America. That's devastating. In my days of growing up, it was almost unheard of. And if you did do it, it was an embarrassment.
You're talking about marriage. You're talking about birth out of wedlock, right? Birth out of wedlock.
Yeah. Absolutely. And abortion was unheard of when I was growing up. I knew no one who had an abortion. If a woman got pregnant, she was married, she had that baby, if that baby had a form of deformity or whatever, they would just love that baby, raise that baby until that baby had a natural death. They didn't abort that baby because they did not want to deal with it. None of that was going on in the black community. That's only started after the Jim Crow, after the so-called civil rights movement and Jim Crow took over. The Jim Crow law ended and the government took over. That's when black people fell apart. And they have not been any good since then.